They had survived the worst thing in the history of the world. Or so they believed. The people who were alive in Europe in 1353, when the first wave of the Black Death finally began to recede, when the carts stopped coming quite so often, when the grave diggers could finally sleep through a night without being called out, these people believed, with the specific desperate conviction of survivors, that the worst was over. They had been through the fire. They had watched half of Europe die. They had buried their parents and their children and their neighbors, and in some cases everyone they had ever known. And they had come out the other side. They rebuilt. Of course they rebuilt. Human beings rebuild. It is what we do. They married the people who had survived alongside them. They had children, many children, because the population had been halved, and something in the collective human project understood that children were now urgent. They took over the farms and the workshops and the houses of the dead because someone had to, because the world required people to operate it. They said prayers of gratitude. They commissioned paintings showing death defeated. They told their children about what had happened. And their children grew up in a world that had survived the Black Death. A world, they were told, that would not see it again. They were wrong. Welcome to Dull Tales. Tonight we're going back to the plague, but not the one you know. The Black Death of 1347 to 1353 is the famous one. The one that killed between a third and half of Europe's population. The one that changed everything. The economy, the church, the social order, the relationship between the living and the dead. But the plague didn't leave. It came back. In 1361, the second major wave of plague hit Europe. It was called the Pestis Secunda, the second pestilence, and it killed with specific cruelty because it killed differently from the first wave. The first wave had killed indiscriminately. The second wave killed the young. The generation that had been born after 1350, the children of the survivors, the people who had grown up being told they were the lucky ones, the generation that was supposed to inherit a chastened but recovered world. These were the people who died in the Pestis Secunda. Tonight we're going to be with them. Before we go in, the usual. Subscribe if Dull Tales is your late-night company. Leave a comment, tell me where you're listening from. Tell me if you know anything about the second plague that the history books skip over. Let me ask you a few things first. Why did the second wave kill the young specifically? What was different about the population that survived the first wave versus the population born after it? What did it feel like to be a survivor of the first plague, to have watched half your world die, and then watch it happen again? What does that specific second horror do to a person? What happened to the social and economic changes that the first plague had started? Did the second wave accelerate them or reverse them? Were there people who survived both waves? And if so, what did they carry with them for the rest of their lives? And the question that connects to the present in ways that are uncomfortable. What happens to a society's relationship with death when death comes twice in a generation? Tonight we find out. Congratulations! You've just woken up in the city of Florence in the spring of 1361. You survived the first plague. You are one of the people who came through. You have children who were born after 1350, children who have never known the plague, who have only heard about it from you, who believe it is something that happened to the world before they were born. The rats are dying in your neighbor's house. Let's go in. Let me start with what the survivors carried. Not the material things, the houses they had inherited, the farms they had absorbed, the economic mobility that the labor shortage had suddenly granted them. The internal things, the specific psychological residue of having watched half the world die when you were 20 or 30 years old. The survivors of the 1347-1353 plague were not psychologically intact. This is not an analysis or a modern diagnosis imposed on a historical population. It is what the historical record shows. The specific behavioral changes, the religious obsessions, the art that emerged from the plague years, the specific relationship with death that the surviving generation developed, and that shaped their culture for the rest of the century. The danse macabre, the dance of death, was the art movement that the first plague produced. Paintings and woodcuts showing death as a dancing skeleton, leading people of every social class in an equal procession toward the grave. Kings and peasants, bishops and merchants, all dancing together toward the same end. Death as the great leveler, death as universal, death as something. And that came for everyone regardless of their prayers or their wealth or their virtue. The first plague had demonstrated this with comprehensive thoroughness. The survivors painted it because they had seen it. They also produced, in the decades after the first wave, a specific kind of religious intensity, the flagellant movement, the obsessive building of plague chapels and memorials, the specific medieval preoccupation with the ars moriendi, the art of dying well. As if the experience of watching so many people die badly, suddenly, painfully, without last rites, without farewell, had created in the survivors a need to think about death constantly, to prepare for it, to give it the ceremony and attention that the plague had stripped from so many deaths. A woman named Katerina had survived the first plague. She was 41 years old in 1361, which meant she had been 27 when the first wave arrived in Florence. She had watched her husband die. She had watched 2 of her 3 children die. The third, a daughter named Margarita, had survived and was now 12 years old. She had contracted the plague herself, lain in the specific delirium of it for 5 days, and then, inexplicably, without any medical intervention that the 14th century could provide, recovered. She had been living with that recovery for 14 years. The specific quality of Katerina's survival was not simple relief. It was, and the historical record of plague survivors, the memoirs and the letters and the spiritual accounts, is consistent on this. It was a complicated thing. Relief, yes, but also the specific guilt of having lived when others hadn't. The specific bewilderment of a God who had let half the world die and had inexplicably preserved her. The specific hypervigilance of a person who has been close enough to death to feel its temperature, who knows from experience that it can arrive without warning. She was grateful for Margarita. She was afraid for Margarita in a way that had not diminished in 14 years. Let me tell you about the children. The generation born between 1350 and 1361, the post-plague children, the ones whose parents had survived, were growing up in a world that was, in specific ways, better than the world their parents had known before the plague. The labor shortage that the plague had produced was real and persistent. The death of a third to half of the workforce had driven wages up, in defiance of everything the feudal economic order had tried to maintain. The peasant who had been bound to the land by the feudal structure found, in the 1350s, that lords were competing for labor, that the specific scarcity of workers had created a negotiating leverage that peasants had never previously possessed. It was not equality. The feudal order did not collapse overnight, but it was loosening, visibly, in ways that would eventually become the economic transformation of the following century. The children of the survivors were growing up in this looser world. They were also growing up with something the previous generation had not had, the experience of being precious. The plague had made children precious in a specific, urgent way. A population that had been halved understood, viscerally, that the generation now being born was the civilization's recovery. Every child who survived to adulthood was a restoration. The post-plague children were raised with the specific combination of anxious attention and desperate hope that characterizes parents who know, from personal experience, how quickly children can be taken. A boy named Luca was 12 years old in 1361. He was the son of a wool merchant in Florence, born in 1349, the year after the first plague arrived, the year before it began to recede. He had been told about the plague by his parents, by his neighbors, by the priests who still preached about it as the defining event of the recent past. He knew about it the way children know about things that happened before they were born, intellectually, as information, without the felt knowledge that only experience can provide. He had never been afraid of it. He had never had reason to be afraid of it. He was 12 years old, healthy, growing up in a city that was rebuilding with the specific energy of a population that has survived something terrible and has decided that survival requires activity, commerce, beauty. Florence in 1360 was building churches and commissioning paintings and trading wool and arguing about politics with the specific intensity of people who have been given a second chance and intend to use it. Luca was growing up in this Florence. He was not afraid. Let me tell you about the rats. The Black Death, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible, is primarily a disease of rodents, particularly rats. The fleas that carry it between rats and occasionally to humans are the mechanism of transmission. When rat populations in a city begin to die from plague, the fleas that have been living on them seek new hosts. The new hosts are the humans who live alongside the rats. The specific sign of coming plague in a medieval city was dead rats. In the spring of 1361, rats began dying in the port cities of Europe. The plague had been in the Middle East, in Central Asia, in North Africa, the same reservoir of infection that had produced the first wave. And now the fleas were moving again, the rats were dying again, and the specific sequence that had begun in 1347 was beginning again. Not everyone recognized it immediately. The people who recognized it immediately were the survivors of the first wave, the people who had been old enough in 1347 to understand what they were seeing. For these people, the dead rats were unmistakable. They had seen this before. Katerina saw a dead rat in her neighbor's courtyard on a Monday morning in April. She stood in the street and looked at it and felt something that was not exactly fear. Fear was too active for what she felt. It was closer to the specific cold recognition of something you have been afraid of for 14 years arriving at the door. She went home. She held Margarita. She did not explain why. Let me tell you what was different about the second wave. Because the second wave was not the same as the first, and the difference is medically significant and humanly devastating. The first wave of plague killed with something approaching democratic indifference. It killed the young and the old, the healthy and the sick, the rich and the poor. Certain populations had higher mortality rates than others, the very young and the very old, the malnourished, the already sick, but no age group was immune. The specific terror of the first wave was its universality. The second wave was different. The second wave killed the young with disproportionate severity. The reason for this is immunological. The survivors of the first wave had, in some proportion, developed partial immunity to the pathogen, not a complete protection, but a specific immune memory that gave their bodies a response to the infection that the bodies of the unexposed did not have. The population that had survived the first wave was, in statistical terms, more resistant than average. The population born after the first wave had no such resistance. The children and young adults of 1361, the people under approximately 20 years old, had never been exposed. Their immune systems had no memory of the pathogen. When the second wave arrived, they were as vulnerable as the pre-plague population had been in 1347, but their parents were more resistant than average. The result was something that turned the natural order of catastrophe upside down. In the second wave, parents watched their children die. Not universally, not in every case, but with a statistical regularity that was visible, that was commented on by contemporary observers, that is documented in the mortality records that survive. The pestis secunda killed the young. Katerina, who had survived the first wave at 27, was more resistant in 1361 than Margarita, who had never been exposed. She would survive the second wave. Margherita would not. Let me give you the city of Florence in the spring of 1361, before the plague arrived, because the before matters. Florence in 1361 was one of the most economically and culturally dynamic cities in Europe. The wool trade, the banking houses, the specific commercial intelligence of the Florentine merchant class, these had not been destroyed by the first plague. They had been disrupted, reduced, reorganized. But the survivors had rebuilt the commercial infrastructure with the specific urgency of people who understood that the alternative was continued poverty. The streets smelled of the specific combination of things that made Florence what it was. The lanolin of the wool being processed in the workshops, the bread from the numerous bakeries, the river smell of the Arno on warm days, the incense from the many churches, the specific animal and human smell of a dense medieval city that did not have the plumbing to manage its waste as efficiently as it might. It was, by contemporary accounts, a beautiful city. Boccaccio had written about it, had written about the 1347 plague from inside it, his Decameron framed as a group of survivors telling stories to each other in a villa outside the city while the plague raged below. The literary Florence of Boccaccio's plague years was a city of social collapse and desperate pleasure, the specific extremity of people who did not know if they would be alive the following week. The Florence of 1361 was different. It was a city of reconstruction. It was building and trading and arguing about politics and religion with the specific energy of people who had decided that the task was to live, to make things, to fill the spaces the dead had left. Luca walked through this floor, and see, every morning on his way to his father's workshop. He walked past the baptistry, which was being decorated with the bronze doors that Ghiberti would eventually win the commission for, though that specific commission was still decades away. He walked past the ongoing construction of the Duomo, the cathedral whose dome would not be completed for another 60 years, but whose presence was already enormous in the city's skyline and in the city's sense of itself. He walked past the markets, the shops, the specific street-level commerce of a city that was alive. He was 12 years old. He had his father's wool samples to deliver. He walked quickly because it was a Tuesday and there was work to do. Let me now give you the specific moment when the second plague arrived in a city. Not the first death. The first death was often not identified as plague. It was identified as fever, as a common illness, as the kind of thing that kills people in medieval cities with some regularity. The moment the second plague arrived was the moment the second person died of the swelling, the bubo, the enlarged lymph node in the armpit or the groin or the neck that was the plague's most specific physical signature. When the first person died of fever, it might be anything. When the second person died of fever with the swelling, you knew. In Florence in the late spring of 1361, the second person was identified in the first week of June. The city knew within days. The specific speed of information transmission in a medieval city is one of the more interesting features of the period. There was no newspaper, no official announcement system for public health information. But there were neighbors, and there were priests who gave sermons and could address their entire congregation at once, and there were the specific social networks of a dense urban population where news of any kind, good or bad, moved through the city in hours. Within a week of the second identified death, everyone in Florence knew. The response was not the same as the response to the first wave. In 1347, the first wave had arrived as a complete surprise, a disease for which there was no framework, no precedent, no preparation. The specific horror of the first wave had been partly the confusion, the complete absence of any understanding of what was happening or why. In 1361, Florence knew exactly what was happening. The survivors knew, and the knowledge made it worse in some ways and better in others. Better, the city organized faster. The separation of the sick from the healthy, the removal of the dying to the lazaretto, the cessation of public gatherings. These responses had been developed during the first wave and were implemented more quickly in the second. Worse, the knowledge meant that the full weight of what was coming arrived in the survivor's consciousness all at once, without the partial protection of not understanding. In 1347, the terror had built gradually as the scale became clear. In 1361, the survivors already knew the scale. They had lived it once. Katerina began making arrangements. She had lived through the first plague in a state of partial incomprehension, the specific cognitive mercy of not fully understanding what was happening. She did not have that mercy this time. She knew what the dead rat meant. She knew what the second death from swelling meant. She knew what the next weeks were likely to bring. She sent Margarita to a cousin's farm outside the city. This was the standard response of those who could afford it. The wealthy and the prosperous sent their children and their dependents to the countryside, where the disease moved more slowly through a sparser population. The city itself, with its density and its rats and its constant commercial traffic, was the most dangerous place to be. Margarita went. She was 12 years old. She thought her mother was being overly cautious. She had heard about the first plague. It was something that had happened to old people, to a previous generation. It was not something that happened to healthy 12-year-olds in 1361. She went to the farm. She was safe at first. Let me tell you about Luca's father. His name was Pietro, and he was 44 years old in 1361, which meant he had been 29 when the first plague arrived. He had survived it, which meant he was now, like most Florence survivors of his generation, more resistant to the second wave than his son was. He did not know this. The concept of immunity, the specific biological mechanism by which previous exposure to a pathogen provides partial protection against subsequent exposure, was not available to the 14th century in any form. The survivors of the first plague knew, empirically, that some people seemed to be more resistant than others. They had no framework for explaining this. The medical explanations of the period, miasma, humoral imbalance, the specific conjunction of plan, did not map onto the biological reality. Pietro knew that he had survived the first plague. He did not know why. He did not know whether his survival was because of his body's specific resistance, because of the specific variant of the disease he had been exposed to, because of luck, or because of God's specific intervention on his behalf. All four of these explanations were equally available to him, and he held them simultaneously in the specific medieval way of not requiring his explanations to be mutually exclusive. He sent Luca to the farm with a message for a business associate who lived in that direction. He did this because sending Luca to the country seemed prudent, because the last time the plague had come the city had been the most dangerous place, because he was a prudent man. He did not know that he was making a decision that would save his son's life. He thought he was being careful. Let me now give you the experience of living through the second plague in a city that had already survived the first. The specific emotional texture of the second wave was different from the first in ways that the historical record preserves with enough detail to reconstruct. The first plague had produced a specific kind of social dissolution. Boccaccio described it with particular horror: parents abandoning children, children abandoning parents, the specific breakdown of the basic human obligations toward the sick and the dying. The fear had been so total that the bonds of care had in many cases been overwhelmed. The second plague did not produce the same dissolution. This is partly because the death rate in the second wave, while high, was lower overall than the first. The partial immunity of the surviving generation reduced the total mortality, and partly because the survivors of the first wave had, over the intervening 14 years, developed something like a plague culture, a specific set of practices and attitudes and social technologies for managing epidemic disease that had not existed in 1347. The lazarettos, the designated isolation facilities for the sick, were better organized. The burial practices were more established. The specific protocols for managing a plague in a city were, if not good, at least not being invented from scratch. And the survivors of the first wave had already made their peace, in whatever way people make peace with the worst thing they have seen, with the idea that plague could come and go and that you had to live through it. This did not mean it was less terrible. It meant it was terrible in a slightly different way. Katerina's neighbor, a woman named Fiamma, who was 39 and who had also survived the first plague, described the second wave in a letter to her sister in another city. The letter survives in a Florentine archive. She wrote, "The second time is not like the first. The first time we did not understand. The second time we understand everything and cannot pretend otherwise. I find I am more afraid now than I was in the first plague, not less, because now I know what is coming." This is the specific psychology of the second wave. Not the shock of the first, something closer to informed dread. The specific horror of knowing. Let me take you outside the city. Because the farm that Margarita was sent to, the farm where Pietro had sent Luca with the message, was not entirely safe. The countryside was safer than the city. The lower density of population meant the plague moved more slowly through it. The absence of the port traffic that seeded new infections from arriving ships meant the countryside saw the plague later and in lower concentrations. But it was not immune. The farm where Margarita was staying was 12 kilometers outside Florence. It was a working farm, olives and grapes and some grain, run by Caterina's cousin, a man named Bernardo, who was 60 and who had survived the first plague and who received Margarita with the specific warm practicality of an older man who has been asked to look after a child and knows how. Luca arrived at the farm 2 days after Margarita with his father's message. He was 12 years old. She was 12 years old. They had not previously met. Their families were not closely connected, but the specific social world of the Florentine extended family and merchant community meant that the connections existed. Caterina and Pietro knew each other slightly from the neighborhood, and Luca staying at the farm for a few days while waiting to see how the city situation developed was a reasonable arrangement. He stayed. He helped with the farm work. He and Margarita talked, the way 12-year-olds talk when they are put together by circumstance and have time and nothing immediately dangerous to do. They talked about Florence. They talked about their families. They talked, inevitably, about the plague, the thing that had brought them both to this farm, the thing that was happening in the city they had left. Margarita told Luca what her mother had told her about the first plague. Luca told Margarita what his father had told him. They were telling each other the stories of their parents' survival. They did not know, sitting in the courtyard of Bernardo's farm in June 1361, that one of them would survive the second plague and one would not. Let me tell you about the immunological reality. Because it explains the specific cruelty of the second wave, in a way that no one in 1361 could understand, but that we now can. The plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, produces in survivors a specific immune response. The body generates antibodies to the infection, and these antibodies persist for some time after recovery. The duration and effectiveness of this protection vary, but survivors of the first wave had some degree of partial immunity. More importantly, there is evidence that some survivors of the first wave possessed specific genetic factors that made them more resistant to the infection. The Delta 32 mutation on the CCR5 gene, which is associated with resistance to bubonic plague, and is found at significantly higher rates in European populations than in non-European populations, probably because the plague created selective pressure for it, was present at some level in the 1350s population. The people who survived the first wave were not a random sample of the pre-plague population. They were disproportionately the people with some form of resistance, whether immunological from prior exposure to related bacteria or genetic. Their children inherited this advantage. But the children born immediately after the first wave, born to survivors who had not yet had time to reproduce in large numbers, were not yet the majority. The children who were 12 in 1361, born in 1349, had been born to parents who had not yet fully replaced themselves. The specific demographic mathematics meant that a significant portion of the 1349-1361 generation was children of parents whose resistance had not yet been fully expressed in the gene pool. And the children who were the most vulnerable were the ones whose parents happened to lack the specific resistance factors. Margarita's mother had survived the first plague, but the survival of the first plague did not mean full immunity to the second. It meant partial resistance, and partial resistance is not the same as safety. Let me give you the specific experience of plague arriving in the countryside. It arrived more slowly than in the city. The sequence was the same, the rats first, the fleas following the first human cases, but it was slower, less concentrated, less total. The farm saw its first death in late July. Not Margarita, a farmhand named Simone, who had been working the olive grove. He developed fever on a Monday and was dead by Thursday. The swelling under his arm was unmistakable to Bernardo, who had seen it 14 years before and who moved with the specific decisive practicality of someone who knows exactly what they are looking at. He separated the remaining household. He sent the farmhand's family to a neighboring property. He established the specific quarantine protocols that had been developed during the first wave and that the survivors of it had internalized as the appropriate response. Margarita and Luca were kept together in the upper part of the farmhouse, away from the areas where Simone had been, while Bernardo managed the situation below. They stayed in the upper room. They were frightened for the first time, in the specific way of people who had been told about the plague abstractly, and are now experiencing it as a concrete, proximate reality. The farmhand they had seen every morning, the farmhand who had shown Luca how to check the ripeness of the olives, the farmhand who was now dead. They stayed in the upper room. They talked. They ate what Bernardo sent up. They waited. Let me now take you back to Florence, to Caterina, who had sent her daughter to the country and who was now living alone in her house with the plague moving through the city around her. The specific experience of waiting in a plague city for news of whether the people you love are safe is one of the most documented forms of anxiety in the historical record of epidemic disease. It is documented in the letters, in the diaries, in the spiritual accounts of the survivors. The specific quality of that waiting, the days passing without news, the imagination supplying the worst possibilities, the specific discipline required to keep functioning when the mind is constantly asking the question it cannot answer. Caterina had sent a message with Luca when he left for the farm. She had received one message back, in early July, saying that Margarita was well. That was the last message. The roads between the city and the countryside were complicated during a plague, people moving in both directions, some fleeing the city, some returning, the specific disruption to normal commerce and communication that the epidemic produced. Messages were slower than usual. The absence of a message did not mean something was wrong. But the absence of a message was still the absence of a message. She managed the household. She went to church. Though the church was less well attended than it had been, the priests were dying too, in this wave as in the previous one, and some churches had no priest to offer services. She visited her neighbor Fiamma. She watched the city around her. Florence in the summer of 1361 had the specific quality of a city that has been through this before, and is going through it again, not the complete social breakdown of the first wave, but a reduction. Fewer people in the streets, more closed doors. The specific quietude of a population that is moving between fear and the practical necessity of continuing to live. She was 41 years old. She had survived the first plague at 27. She would survive the second plague at 41. She did not know this. She knew only the waiting. Let me tell you about the specific relationship between the first plague and religious belief. Because the religious consequences of the first wave were enormous and shaped the specific culture that the second wave was happening inside. The first plague had created a theological crisis of significant proportions. The question that drove it was simple: why? Why had God allowed this? The Black Death had killed popes and bishops and priests alongside the general population. It had killed the good and the wicked with equal impartiality. It had killed children who had committed no sin that any theology could identify. The standard theological frameworks for understanding suffering, sin, punishment, divine testing, struggled to contain the scale and the randomness of the first plague. The Church's authority had been damaged by the first wave in specific ways. The institutional church, the wealthy, powerful, landowning church that held a dominant position in European society, had not protected its people from the plague. Its prayers had not worked. Its sacraments had been offered by priests who then died of the disease they had just administered last rites for. Its moral authority had been demonstrated to be no protection against the bacterium. The specific religious response that this produced was varied and contradictory. Some people intensified their religious practice. The flagellants, the plague chapels, the intense personal piety that expressed itself in increasingly private forms of devotion. If the institutional church had failed, then perhaps the individual's personal relationship with God was what mattered. Some people lost their faith entirely, or held it with a specific bitterness. The specific medieval version of "if God exists, why does he allow suffering?" had received in the first plague the most comprehensive possible demonstration of the suffering. And some people developed a complicated, negotiated, ongoing argument with God that was neither wholehearted devotion nor complete rejection. Something more like the specific relationship that develops between a person and an authority that has disappointed them profoundly, but that they are not yet ready to abandon entirely. Katerina was in the third category. She prayed every day. She went to church when there was a priest to conduct the service. She made her devotions to the Virgin with the specific regularity of a woman who had survived two terrible things and attributed both survivals to divine intervention. But she also prayed, sometimes, with a specific anger underneath the prayer, the anger of someone who had watched her husband and two of her children die, who had survived something that had killed half the world, who had 14 years later been asked to watch it happen again. She prayed. She was also angry. Both of these things were true simultaneously. This is not unusual. This is what the historical record of the plague survivors shows. Not simple faith and not simple rejection, but the complicated negotiated relationship between a human being and the divine when the divine has not behaved as expected. Let me give you Luca's experience. He was 12 years old and he was in an upper room of a farm in the Tuscan countryside, and a man he knew was dead of plague below him, and his father was in Florence, and he did not know if his father was alive. The specific terror of a 12-year-old in this situation is not the same as the terror of an adult. It is more total in some ways, because the child has fewer resources for managing it, fewer frameworks, less experience of having survived fear, less of the specific hard-won knowledge that fear passes. And it is also less conceptualized. Luca was afraid in a way that was more bodily than intellectual, the specific physical manifestation of fear without the overall eye of analytical thinking that an adult would have applied to the situation. He was also, because he was 12, capable of periods of complete absorption in other things. The upper room had a small window that looked out over the olive grove. In the afternoon light, the grove was beautiful, the specific silver green of olive leaves in the Tuscan summer, the quality of light in the late afternoon that the painters of this period were already beginning to learn how to capture. He looked at the olive grove. He was afraid. He also noticed that the light on the olive leaves was very beautiful. Margarita noticed him looking. She looked too. They were 12 years old and they were frightened, and the olive grove was beautiful, and these things coexisted in the specific way that they coexist in childhood, where the emotional and the sensory do not always separate neatly into appropriate and inappropriate responses. Let me tell you about the death rate. The second wave killed approximately 20% of the European population, compared to the 30 to 50% of the first wave. This is a smaller percentage. It is not a small number. 20% of the European population in 1361 was somewhere between 12 and 15 million people. 12 to 15 million people. In a second wave, a wave that came 14 years after the first. A civilization that had already lost a third to half of itself now lost another fifth of what was left. The cumulative demographic effect of the first and second waves was catastrophic in ways that are difficult to fully comprehend. The population of Europe would not return to its pre-plague levels until the 16th century, 200 years after the first wave. 200 years. The plague did not end in 1353. It did not end in 1362. The third wave came in 1369. The fourth in 1374, the fifth in 1382. The plague returned to Europe approximately every decade for the rest of the 14th century and continued to recur through the 15th and into the 16th. Each wave killed fewer people than the one before, as the population developed more resistance, but each wave killed people. The second wave killed Margarita. She developed fever in the first week of August. The swelling appeared on the second day. She was dead on the fourth. Luca was in the room. He watched her die. He was 12 years old. He had known her for 6 weeks. Let me now give you the survivors of the second wave. What did they carry? Luca survived the second wave. He returned to Florence in October when the epidemic had largely run its course in the city. He found his father alive. Pietro had survived, the partial immunity of the first wave having served its purpose, the specific biological advantage of prior exposure having been sufficient. They had both lost people. Pietro had lost his business partner, who died in August. He had lost 2 neighbors. He had lost the specific social world of his street, which would need to be rebuilt with the people who were left. Luca had lost Margarita. He would carry this for the rest of his life in the specific way that the deaths you witness as a child are carried. Not always consciously, not always articulately, but present in the specific response to loss that had been formed around this first major experience of it. The second wave produced, across Europe, a generation of children who had grown up being told they were the lucky ones, the post-plague generation, the children of survivors, the ones who had been spared, and who had then experienced in their adolescence the specific discovery that the sparing was not permanent. This generation became the adults who built the late 14th century. They built it with the specific knowledge that catastrophe could return. They were not the lost generation in the way that the phrase is used about later periods. They were, if anything, an intensified generation, people who had learned early that time was not guaranteed, and who brought to the business of living a specific urgency that the previous generation, in its Reconstruction optimism, had perhaps not had. Some of them became artists. The Renaissance was being assembled in Florence by exactly the generation that survived the Second Plague and the specific quality of its attention. The attention to the individual human face, to the particular body, to the specific mortal beauty of the human form, owes something to the experience of having watched specific individuals die. Some of them became merchants, traders, builders, the specific practical optimism of the commercial class continuing through the waves of death, because commerce was what made the continuation possible. Some of them became bitter. Some of them became pious. Some of them became the flagellants who walked through city streets beating themselves, the theological bargaining made physical. And some of them became people like Kat. Irina. Let me give you Katerina, in the autumn of 1361. She received the news of Margherita's death in a letter from Bernardo, delivered to her house in Florence in August. She read the letter. She sat in her house. She had survived the first plague, in which she had lost her husband and 2 children. She had survived the second plague, in which she had lost her 3rd child. She was 41 years old. She had survived everything. The specific quality of Katerina's survival, what it meant, what it cost, what it produced in the specific interior life of a woman who had buried 4 people who mattered to her, and who was still alive at 41 in 1361. This is something that the historical record preserves incompletely, as it preserves most things about women's inner lives in the medieval period. What we have are fragments. We know she continued to attend church. We know she made a donation to a local plague chapel in Margherita's name. We know she continued to manage the household. We know that in the following years she was active in the neighborhood welfare arrangements that the plague had made necessary, the specific community mutual aid that developed in Florence as a response to the epidemic losses. She kept living. This is what the survivors did. Not because surviving was easy, not because the losses were manageable or the grief was proportionate or the theological crisis was resolved, but because the alternative to keeping living was dying, and the survivors of the first plague had already made, in some fundamental way, the decision to keep living. They had made it in 1353. They were still making it in 1361. They would make it again in 1369. The plague kept coming back. They kept surviving. Let me tell you about the economic consequences of the second wave. Because the second wave, arriving 14 years after the first, hit a population and an economy that were still recovering from the first. The labor shortage that the first wave had produced had begun to resolve, not because the population had recovered, but because wages had eventually been driven up enough to bring more people into the market, and because the specific economic efficiency of the surviving population had adjusted to the new conditions. The second wave created a second labor shortage on top of an economy that had not yet fully recovered from the first. This had specific economic effects. The peasants and the skilled workers who survived the second wave were, once again, in short supply. The wages that had been driven up by the first plague were driven up further by the second. The specific feudal obligations that lords had been trying to maintain despite the first plague's demographic damage were now even more difficult to enforce. The lords needed the labor, and the labor could negotiate. The Statute of Laborers in England, the 1351 law that attempted to force workers to accept pre-plague wages and prevent them from moving in search of better conditions, was increasingly unenforceable after the second wave. The specific gap between what the law said and what the economic reality required was too large. The second plague accelerated what the first had begun. The feudal order was not destroyed overnight. It never is. But the specific conditions that had maintained it, the labor surplus that kept workers in a weak negotiating position, the lord's ability to enforce obligations on a workforce that had no alternatives, these conditions were progressively undermined by the plague's demographic work. The world that emerged from the repeated plague waves of the 14th century was a more economically mobile world than the world before 1347. Not a just world, not an equal world, but a world where the specific bonds of serfdom were looser, where the skilled worker had more options than before, where the specific human dignity of the laborer was slightly more difficult to completely deny. This was not what the lords intended. This was what happened anyway. Let me now slow down. Let me take you back to the farm, to October, to Luca preparing to return to Florence. He is helping Bernardo with the harvest. The olives are ready. It is the kind of October work that has a specific beauty, the cool air, the silver trees, the specific satisfaction of work that produces something real and visible. Margherita has been dead for 2 months. He thinks about her. He thinks about the upper room. He thinks about the afternoon light on the olive trees that she had also seen. He thinks about the conversations, the ones about Florence, about their parents, about the plague, about what their parents had survived. He thinks about how completely he had not known her 6 weeks before she died, and how present she had become in those 6 weeks, and how absent she is now. He is 12 years old. He does not have the vocabulary for what he is experiencing. He picks olives from the tree. He puts them in the basket. He will carry what happened here, the summer of 1361, the upper room, the olive grove, the death, for the rest of his life. He does not know, picking olives on an October afternoon in the Tuscan countryside, that he will live to be 63, that he will marry and have 4 children, all of whom will survive childhood, that the plague will return in 1369 and in 1374, and that he will survive those waves too, that he will eventually become the kind of wealthy merchant that his father was trying to make him, that the Florence he returns to in October will be different from the Florence he left in June, as it was always different, as it always rebuilt. He does not know any of this. He knows October and olives and the specific grief of a 12-year-old who has seen someone die for the first time. He picks the olives. He fills the basket. He keeps going. Let me close by telling you what the second wave meant for the longer arc. Because the second wave is not just a footnote to the first. It is part of a longer story about what it means for a civilization to face repeated catastrophe, not the single devastating event, but the recurrence, the return, the plague that came back and came back again. The 14th century plague was not one event. It was a series of events, spaced approximately a decade apart, each one killing a smaller percentage than the one before, each one arriving into a population that was still recovering from the previous one. The civilization that came through this was not the civilization that had entered it. The medieval world of the early 14th century, hierarchical, theologically certain, economically rigid, demographically abundant, was not the world that emerged from the century of plague. What emerged was more skeptical, more economically mobile, more focused on the individual human life as the unit of meaning, more interested in the body and in this world rather than in the theological abstractions of the next. The Renaissance is not a coincidence. The specific humanism of the Renaissance, its attention to the individual human face, its interest in the classical world as a source of frameworks for living in this world, its specific quality of engagement with the human rather than the abstract divine, this was not inevitable. It was the specific response of a specific civilization to the specific experience of watching, repeatedly in waves, the mortality of everyone around it. The plague killed people. The people who survived built something with the specific knowledge that survival was temporary, that beauty was perishable, that the human face was worth capturing because it would not last. Luca grew up to be a merchant. His children grew up in a city building, something that would last. The olive grove was beautiful. The light on the leaves was the light. Sleep. Good night. Let me give you one more thing before we close completely. Let me give you the medical account. Because the specific biology of what happened in the second wave is one of the more remarkable features of the history of epidemic disease, and it connects the 14th century to the present in ways that are worth dwelling on. The second wave of plague was not the last time humanity would face a disease that killed the young more severely than the old. The 1918 influenza pandemic, the Spanish flu, killed with a similar demographic inversion. Young adults, particularly those between 20 and 40 years old, died in disproportionately high numbers. The specific immune mechanism was different from the plagues, but the pattern was similar. The young died, the old survived. The reason in both cases was related to prior exposure and immune experience. The elderly population of 1918 had lived through earlier influenza waves that provided partial cross-immunity. The young had not. The specific tragedy of 1918, as of 1361, was the disproportionate death of those who had not yet had the chance to accumulate the immune experience that partially protected their elders. The specific lesson that public health has taken from these histories: immunity is a resource that accumulates over time, and the loss of a generation's immune experience, whether through the death of those who carry it or through the failure to expose the next generation appropriately, has specific demographic consequences that repeat across centuries. We are in the 21st century, still learning from 1361. The plague comes back. The immune system remembers. The generation that survives builds something. The next generation is vulnerable. The plague comes back. This is not despair. This is the cycle, and the cycle includes the building, and the building is what makes the cycle survivable. Sleep. Katerina survived. Luca survived. The olive grove is still in Tuscany. The light is still on the leaves. Good night. Thank you for being here tonight. The second plague wave is one of the most overlooked episodes in the history of the Black Death, and the specific story of a generation that grew up being told they were the lucky ones and then found out they were not. This is a story that deserves more attention than it gets. Subscribe if Dull Tales is your late-night company. Leave a comment. Tell me if you knew about the Pesti Secunda. Tell me if you've been to Florence and stood in the spaces where Caterina and Luca walked. Next time, the medieval apprentice. 7 years without wages, without marriage, without freedom of movement. The specific contract that young people signed to learn a trade in the 14th century, and what it was actually like to live inside it. But tonight, the second wave, the olive grove, the upper room, the light on the leaves. Good night. Let me give you more of the world. More of the specific texture of the second wave's daily life. The things that happened between the deaths, in the spaces where ordinary life tried to continue despite the plague. Let me give you the market. The Florence market in the summer of 1361 was a reduced version of itself, but not an absent one. Commerce had to continue, people had to eat, goods had to move. The specific economic machinery of a trading city had to keep turning even when a significant portion of the population was either dead or avoiding public spaces. The market operated with masks. Not surgical masks, the specific beak-shaped plague masks that are the most iconic image of plague medicine are a later development, primarily from the 17th century. But face coverings of various kinds, cloth soaked in vinegary water or aromatic herbs, were used by the 14th century population as protection against the miasma that was believed to be the plague's mechanism of transmission. A spice merchant named Ginevra was at the market. She was 34 years old. She had been 5 years old during the first plague, too young to have retained clear memories of it, but old enough to have absorbed the specific anxieties that her surviving parents had carried. She was not a first-wave survivor in any meaningful sense. She had been a child during it, protected by adults who had made the specific decisions that had preserved her. She was the generation between the first and second waves, old enough to have missed the first plague as a full participant, young enough to have grown up in the recovery world, and now present for the second wave as a full adult with a workshop and a reputation and a stake in the commercial life of the city. She was selling spices, not the most essential goods in a plague crisis, you might think, but the medieval understanding of plague prevention gave spices a specific role. The strongly aromatic herbs and spices, camphor, cloves, cinnamon, sandalwood, were believed to counteract the miasmal bad air that caused the disease. Whether or not this was medically accurate, it was believed, and belief drove commerce, and Ginevra's sales were actually up during the plague because of the specific demand for aromatic prophylactics. She sold spices to the worried Florentines. She also talked to them, because the spice market was a social space as well as a commercial one, and the specific information exchange of people comparing notes on who had died and who had survived, and which neighborhoods were worst affected, and which seemed to be doing better, was a form of epidemiological surveillance that predated modern public health by 600 years. She knew the city's mortality pattern in real time from her market stall. She knew which streets were worst. She knew, roughly, how many people had died. She told her husband in the evenings, reconstructing the day's information with the specific attention of someone who understood that this knowledge was protection. She also sold a great deal of camphor. Let me give you the priests. Because the clergy were among the most disproportionately affected groups in both waves of the plague, and their specific vulnerability and their specific response to it shaped the religious character of the second wave. The clergy died during the plague for a specific and somewhat grim reason. Their professional obligations required them to be with the dying. The administration of last rites, the final sacraments that medieval Christianity considered essential for a good death, required a priest to be physically present with the dying person. The priest came to the plague household. The priest administered the sacrament. The priest was then in close proximity to a plague victim, with all the flea exposure that implied. The first wave had killed clergy in enormous numbers. The second wave found the clergy depleted by the first. The specific population of trained priests was smaller than it had been in 1347, because the dead could not be replaced as quickly as the training pipeline required. Some parishes in the second wave had no priest at all. This had specific religious consequences. A dying person who could not receive last rites was, in the medieval theological framework, in a compromised position with respect to salvation. The specific terror of dying without last rites, in a culture that took the theology of purgatory and the specific mechanics of the afterlife very seriously, was a real and specific terror for the medieval population. The second wave produced a specific pastoral crisis. More dying people needing last rites, fewer priests to provide them. A young priest named Ser Giovanni, not the Boccaccio, a different Giovanni, was one of the priests who survived the first wave and who was ministering to the Florence parishes during the second. He was 28 years old in 1361. He had been ordained at 22, a year before the second plague arrived. He had not been present for the first plague as a priest. He had been a child during it, protected by his family's relative prosperity. Now he was the priest. He administered last rites to everyone he could reach. He also died of the plague in September 1361. He was 28 years old. He had been a priest for 6 years. He was not the only priest who died in the second wave. He was one of many. The church continued to lose clergy through every subsequent wave of the plague, rebuilding its ranks in the spaces between waves, never quite maintaining the pre-plague numbers. The specific institutional depletion of the clergy contributing to the wider institutional weakening that eventually fed the reform movements of the following century. Let me give you the art. Because the art of the second plague wave, what was painted and what was written, and what was built during and after it, is one of the most revealing aspects of the period. The dance macabre tradition, which had begun in the aftermath of the first plague, intensified after the second. The specific image of death as a dancing skeleton leading the living toward the grave. This image was painted on church walls across Europe in the second half of the 14th century, visible to every congregation that entered every church, a constant reminder that mortality was universal. It is tempting to read this as morbidity, as a civilization obsessed with death in a pathological way. But the dance macabre is not only morbid, it is also democratic and even, in its way, comic. The bishop and the king are in the same dance as the peasant and the child. Death does not respect rank or wealth or virtue. The equal treatment of everyone in the dance, the specific visual joke of the pope and the peasant dancing together toward the same destination, has a quality of dark humor that connects it more to the comic than the tragic. The second plague wave also produced some of the most intense individual portraiture in European art, the specific attention to the individual human face that begins to appear in painting in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. This is not a coincidence. A culture that has spent the better part of a generation watching specific faces disappear develops a specific attachment to the individual face as a thing worth preserving. Luca, when he was grown, would commission a portrait, not of himself, of his wife, who died young of one of the later plague waves. He had it painted by a local artist. He kept it for the rest of his life. He looked at it every day. He did not want to forget a face. Let me give you the children of the survivors of the second wave. Because the second wave produced a generation of orphans, children who had lost one or both parents in the second wave, who were now being raised by the extended family and community networks that plague had repeatedly forced into service. A girl named Beatrice was 7 years old when the second wave took her mother. Her father had survived. He was one of the first wave survivors whose partial immunity had extended to the second wave. But her mother had been born after the first wave, in 1355, and was 26 in 1361, and 26 in 1361 was exactly the age at which the second wave was most lethal. Beatrice grew up with her father and her grandmother, and a community of other orphaned and half-orphaned children who were in similar situations. The specific social world of Florence in the 1360s and 1370s included a significant proportion of children raised by single parents or extended families, the two-parent household having been disrupted repeatedly by the plague's demographic work. These children grew up understanding loss as a normal feature of childhood, not in the sense of having no feelings about it. They had feelings, and the historical record of the period includes moving accounts of children's grief, but in the sense of having no expectation that life would be otherwise. The generation that survived the second plague wave and grew to adulthood in the 1370s and 1380s was a generation that knew, from direct personal experience, that the people you love can die suddenly and without warning and without apparent justification. They built the early Renaissance with this knowledge. The specific quality of late 14th and early 15th century Italian art, its tenderness toward the human form, its attention to the individual, its specifically mortal beauty, is the art of people who know that beauty does not last. It is the art of people who have been to the farm and seen the light on the olive leaves and watched someone die. Sleep now. You have been in the second plague tonight. In Caterina's house, waiting for news of Margherita. In Luca's upper room, looking at the olive grove. In Ginevra's spice stall, tracking the city's mortality from her market position. In Sir Giovanni's parish rounds, the young priest who would die at 28 giving last rites. In the dance macabre on the church walls, death and the bishop and the peasant and the child, all dancing toward the same destination. In the portrait that Luca would commission when he was grown, the specific face he did not want to forget. The second plague killed the young. It killed the generation that was supposed to have been spared. It killed Margarita, who had been told her whole life that the plague was something that had happened before her. It also produced, in the people who survived, a specific quality of attention. The attention of people who know that time is not guaranteed, that beauty is perishable, that the individual face is worth capturing because it will not last. The Renaissance was, among other things, a response to the plague. The specific humanist attention to the individual human life, the specific interest in this world and its mortal beauty, these were not invented out of nowhere. They were built by people who had watched individuals die repeatedly in waves, and who had decided that the appropriate response to this was to look more carefully at the individuals who were still here. They looked. They painted what they saw. The paintings are still here. The faces are still there. Sleep. The olive grove is still in Tuscany. The light is still on the leaves. Good night. Let me give you the economic life of the survivor. Because the economics of surviving the second wave were specific and important, and they tell you something about the specific human response to catastrophe that is not simply grief or resilience, but something more complicated. The labor shortage produced by the second wave, arriving on top of the labor shortage still being digested from the first wave, had specific effects on wages and mobility that accelerated the economic changes already underway. A woman named Rosa was a weaver. She was 32 years old in 1362, just old enough to have some memory of the first plague as a child, young enough to have grown up primarily in the recovery years. She had survived the second wave. Her husband had not. She was now a widow with 2 children, and a weaving workshop that she had run jointly with her husband, and that she now ran alone. In the world before the plague, the world of the early 14th century, before 1347, a widow running a craft workshop faced specific obstacles. The guilds that governed the skilled trades in the Italian cities were, in the pre-plague period, structured to maintain the position of male craftsmen against female competition. The specific rules about who could operate a workshop, who could sell finished goods, who could train apprentices, these rules generally disadvantaged women. The plague's demographic work had complicated these rules, not eliminated them. The rules remained on the books, but the specific scarcity of skilled labor meant that the enforcement was more flexible than it had been. The guilds needed workers, and some of those workers were women who had been running workshops alongside their husbands and who knew the trade as well as any man in the guild. Rosa ran her workshop. She sold her cloth. She negotiated her own prices. She was not equal to her male counterparts in any legal or formal sense. She was more powerful than she would have been in 1340. This is the specific economic paradox of the plague's aftermath. The catastrophe that had killed so many people had, in killing them, created conditions that were in some narrow ways better for the people who survived. The labor shortage gave workers leverage. The demographic damage to the guild system loosened some of the specific restrictions that had kept women in secondary economic positions. The plague did not create equality, but it created movement. Rosa moved. She kept the workshop running. Her children grew up learning the trade. Let me give you the theology one more time. Because the second wave's theological consequences were, in some ways, more significant than the first's. The first plague had created a theological crisis. The second plague, arriving 14 years later, confirmed and deepened that crisis in the specific way that repeated experience confirms what single experience suggests. If the first plague had suggested that God's relationship with the world was more complex and less protective than the standard medieval theology held, the second plague moved that suggestion closer to a conclusion. The specific theological development that the plague waves accelerated, the shift toward more personal, less institutional forms of religious practice. The emphasis on the individual believer's direct relationship with God rather than the mediated relationship through the Church. The specific medieval mysticism that developed in the 14th century, alongside and partly in response to the plague. These are the theological fingerprints of a civilization that had watched its religious authorities fail to protect it, and had concluded that protection must be sought elsewhere. The mystics of the 14th century, Julian of Norwich, who we have spent time with in an earlier episode, Catherine of Siena, the German Rhineland mystics, were writing in a period of repeated plague. The specific quality of their theology, immediate, personal, experiential, less mediated by institutional structure, is partly a response to the specific failure of the institutional structure to be adequate to the crisis. Julian's famous "All Shall Be Well" was written by a woman who had grown up in the period of the second and third plague waves, who had nearly died herself, and who had arrived at that conclusion not through the absence of suffering, but through the sustained confrontation with it. All shall be well. Not because the plague will not come back, not because the young will not die, but because something in the deepest structure of things is arranged toward good, even when the surface is catastrophe. This is not simple optimism. It is the hardest one possible conclusion. It is what the survivors built their theology from. Let me give you Luca at 60. Because the history of the second wave does not end in 1361, and Luca's story does not end at 12. He was 60 years old in 1409. He had survived 5 plague waves, the second in 1361, the third in 1369, the fourth in 1374, the fifth in 1382, and the waves of the early 15th century. Each wave had killed people he knew. Each wave had not killed him. He had married in 1374 a woman named Giovanna. They had 4 children. Giovanna had died of the 1382 plague wave when she was 32 and Luca was 33. He had commissioned her portrait. He looked at it every day. In 1409, his children were grown. His eldest son had taken over the wool business. His youngest daughter was married. He was, by the standards of the period, an old man, and the specific quality of his old age was the quality of a man who has survived so many losses that loss has become the texture of his experience. He was not defeated by this. He was not entirely at peace with it either. He was a man who had been attending death since he was 12 years old and who had developed, across 5 decades of loss, the specific wisdom of someone who has learned to hold both the loss and the continuation simultaneously, to love what was here without claiming it would last, to keep going without pretending that keeping going was without cost. He was, by the accounts of the people who knew him, a warm and attentive man, not effusive, not theatrical in his grief or his joy, but present. He paid attention to the people around him with the specific quality of attention that people develop when they have learned that attention has a deadline. He looked at Giovanna's portrait. He missed her. He ate his morning meal. He went to work. This is what surviving looks like across a lifetime. Not triumph, not resolution, not the narrative arc that leads to a meaningful conclusion. Just the morning meal, the work, the going on. And now truly the close. You have been with the second wave tonight. With Katerina, who survived everything and lost everything and kept living. With Margarita, who was told she was the lucky one and wasn't. With Luca in the upper room looking at the olive grove, watching someone die for the first time. With Ginevra selling camphor at her market stall, tracking the city's mortality. With Sir Giovanni, the young priest who died at 28 giving last rites. With Rosa running her workshop. With Beatrice growing up without her mother. With Luca at 60 looking at Giovanna's portrait. These were all specific people in a specific historical moment that lasted not days but years. Not one wave but five. Not one generation's losses but 5 generations' losses. The plague that came and came and came again for 100 years. The people who lived through this built the Renaissance. They built it because they understood Ram direct personal experience, that beauty does not last and therefore must be captured. That the individual human face is worth painting because it will be gone. That the body is mortal and therefore beautiful. That this world, with all its plague and all its loss, is worth attention. The paintings are still here. The olive groves are still in Tuscany. The light is still on the leaves. Sleep. Good night. Let me give you the specific numbers one more time, because numbers in this context are not abstraction but people. The first wave, 1347–1353, approximately 25 million dead in Europe, a third to half the population. The second wave, 1361–1362, approximately 10–15 million dead in Europe. The third wave, 1369, another significant percentage. The fourth, 1374. The fifth, 1382. And then lesser waves through the 15th century. The total, by 1400, Europe's population was approximately half what it had been in 1340. 60 years of plague waves had reduced the population of the continent by half. And still, the survivors built. Not because building was easy. Not because grief was manageable. Not because the losses were acceptable. But because building was the specific task that survival assigned, and the survivors of the 14th century were, above all other things, people who had chosen survival and who understood what survival required. It required getting up. It required the morning meal. It required the work. It required the portrait. It required looking at the light on the olive leaves and understanding that the light is worth looking at precisely because it will not last. The Renaissance was not built in spite of the plague. It was built because of it. Not as compensation, not as denial, but as the specific human response of a civilization that had been shown, repeatedly and comprehensively, that this world and its beauty are temporary, and that had decided collectively that the appropriate response to this is to look more carefully, not less. To paint the face. To write the sonnet. To build the dome. To carve the marble body. To say, I see you. I know you will not last. I am making something that will outlast both of us because the fact that you existed matters. This is the Renaissance. This is what the plague built. Sleep. The faces are in the paintings. The paintings are in the museums. The museums are in Florence. Florence is still there. Good night. One final thing. The plague's genetic legacy. The Delta 32 mutation on the CCR5 gene, the genetic variant that provides some resistance to bubonic plague, is found in approximately 10–15% of people of European descent today. It is believed to have been present at lower frequencies in the pre-plague population and to have increased in frequency through the repeated selective pressure of the plague waves. The people who had this mutation were more likely to survive. Their descendants inherited it. Approximately 10–15% of people of European descent carry a genetic memory of the plague. Not a conscious memory, not a historical memory, a biological one. The plague is in the genes. The survivors are in the genes. Every person of European descent is, at some biological level, a descendant of the people who survived the 14th century plague, because the ones who didn't survive didn't pass on their genes. You are, in some small molecular way, connected to Caterina and Luca and Ginevra and Rosa. You carry something of what they survived. Not the full story, not the olive grove or the upper room or the portrait on the wall, but something, the specific molecular resilience that allowed them to keep going. You are here because they were there. Sleep. Good night.